Yeah, let me just say that. I went to Quito once many years ago, not for work. Strangely enough, hello. Hi. Hello. Hello. Okay. Hi. Hello, good evening. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to everyone who takes time seriously. I think everybody does, but the reality of life happens. We're going to kick off in about 4 minutes from now, regardless of the people in the room. Just because we respect your time, we expect others to join. The event was fully booked for, so fingers crossed. But thank you so much for joining. We'll be starting in the next 3 minutes. And my name is BC Akinkugbe, I should say. I'm one of the editors of Afronomicslaw that's put together this event. Thank you. All right. So we are indeed about to start. So it's good evening to everyone. We do want to thank you once again for joining us. I'll explain the us in a short while, but my name again is Olabisi Akinkugbe. I'm one of the editors of Afronomicslaw. If you're wondering what Afronomicslaw is about, in a nutshell, we are a group of scholars, primarily from different parts of Africa, that thought, we can do more with our time by just putting together this platform, which has become what it is, primarily because people also agree with the idea that the work that is produced by many scholars from the continent of Africa and other parts of the global south need to be centered in the debates that are had across various spheres of the world. And so, whether it's on issues of sovereign debt or other issues in international economic law generally, these are matters that we take closely to heart. But that's not the main thing for today. Really, today is about the second of the events we've had in DC. December 2002, we had the first one where we used this same hall. And today, the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, which is one of the platforms on Afronomicslaw, has put together this event on climate finance and sovereign debt. A very topical one, which from the event description you would have seen, is about centering, various issues around, swaps, debt for nature swaps, sustainability-linked bonds, green, blue, climate bonds, and so on and so forth. Experts will speak to that in a short while. But before I pass the mic to them, I'd just like to say that now that we've started, they will take over. The event is streamed live as well. Shortly after we're done, there'll be a cocktail session. We have our editors here. There'll be time to introduce them after the event has been done itself. But for now, I'd like to pass over to my colleague, James Gathi, who is a professor of law at Loyola University, to take over from here.
Okay, so thanks, BC, and welcome everybody. Delighted to be here with all of you. So our event today, as BC has told you, is on a topic that we've been working on, climate finance and sovereign debt. And if you haven't already gotten out there the book that we published last year on this topic, those of you that perhaps live in Washington, D.C. can afford to buy it on Amazon, but it's also freely available on our website because we provide all the research that we do freely on our website, afronomicslaw.org. So today I'm joined by three stellar panelists to discuss this theme. I will not read their entire bios because they are right here and we want to get right into the discussion. I'll just say a little bit about each of them. So to my right, Fumi Arewa, who is a professor and senior fellow for entrepreneurship and senior scholar at the Center for International Property and Innovation Policy at George Mason, is a good friend. Many things, Stella. If you haven't had or read stuff on IP and Africa, you should. Somebody should show the book she's just published, Disrupting Africa. Who has that book? BC maybe has walked out. She has published a fantastic book on innovation in Africa called this. Oh, it's right there. Somebody's lifting it up there. Disrupting Africa, really amazing book. She's both a lawyer and anthropologist. To my left is my very good friend, other very good friend, Jane Nalunga. She keeps me on my toes on all issues, progressive international economic law. She is an expert on trade, tax, and investment-related issues. And she heads Siatini in Uganda, which is one of the most important groups working on the continent on all matters international economic law. So if you haven't heard about them, you should check them out. And last but not least, to my extreme left is Bio, who is an assistant teaching professor at University of Alberta Faculty of Law, and is one of the senior fellows of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, and one of the core editors of the book on climate finance and sovereign debt that we published last year. Everything on climate finance and climate stuff that I have learned from bio in the last couple of years was fantastic, really working with him, and delighted that he is here. So as I have said, we've been thinking, this network has been thinking, and we've held several events on the continent. We actually launched the book on climate finance and sovereign debt on the sidelines of the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi last September. And so this is sort of the way that our thinking, this panel is a reflection of our evolving thinking and incorporating experts in the field. And what we have been thinking about is to take on what we see as the dominant narrative about climate finance and sovereign debt, that climate finance is going to be the solution to the climate crisis. So we've published an entire book, mostly by African researchers who are based in Africa, that we worked with over several years. And I'll be asking our panelists today to reflect on some of the instruments that we wrote about and that BC just mentioned in a few minutes ago. In the work that we have done, we have centered the impact of these transactions on the countries and people that are least responsible for the debt crisis, for the climate crisis. And secondly, we have centered also the story about how this relates to the historical, ecological responsibility of the countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis. So those are our politics, and we are not afraid to announce them. So in the first round, so we're going to go through several rounds of questions, maybe 2 or 3. So in the first round, I start with Fumi. So Fumi, we hear from the global finance industry that green finance is a catalyst for the global transition to low carbon economies. We also know that heavy debt burdens are slowing down robust responses to the climate crisis. In the meantime, climate finance in the form of debt and innovative, and you're the scholar of innovation, innovative market solutions are now trending. So we hear of solutions such as rainbow bonds, panda bonds, debt for climate swaps and things like that. How should we think of these solutions given the role of the global finance industry in Africa's sovereign debt issues, and taking into account that some of these instruments, especially the bonds, are partly responsible for the heavy debt burdens or distressed that now are being promoted to resolve the climate crisis?
So I first of all wanted to thank James and Afronomics and the African Sovereign Justice Debt Network for sponsoring this session. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start out, I'm an anthropologist, as you know, as well as a lawyer. I'm also an economist. So I'm going to try to blend those things. And my book, Disrupting Africa, also tries to blend those things. And I want to start out by talking about history and context. So I think we often have discussions. We have cycles. First of all, we have a couple of recurrent things that are going on that I want to highlight. We have recurrent cycles of debt crisis. And this is not just the case in Africa. This is present globally. We can talk about at least 2 recent debt crisis cycles in living memory in African context. And I think we need to look at some of the factors that lead to those recurrent patterns of debt crisis and talk about how they happened and how to disrupt those patterns. Because if you don't change the underlying things that lead to debt crisis, you're likely to have those same kind of crises in the future. The second thing I want to talk about is a recurrent pattern of looking for the next best thing. And often it's things like technology. So I write about the digital economy and how many people think technology will solve all our problems. Technology can solve many problems, but it can't solve problems of institution just by putting in technology. We have to think about history and context. So I want to talk about those 2 things, particularly in relation to this, because when we think about global finance rests on a history of institutions and relationships in which African voices have not had sufficient representation. That's a problem that I see as, to a significant degree, an external problem. When I say external and internal, I recognize that these problems are intimately related, but there's an external pattern. If we look at the Bretton Woods institutions, if we look at a lot of global institutions, it's not a secret. There's an ongoing discussion about lack of African representation in those institutional contexts. That's a historical problem. It's also a contemporary problem. It's an ongoing problem that really requires remediation, because many of the institutions we have are not meant to address local problems in African contexts. As a result, those local problems don't even get conceptualized in the right way. And in my book, Disrupting Africa, I talk about patterns of colonial overhang. And what colonial overhang is, it's about an attitude, it's about an idea of where solutions come from. And during colonial context, power was rooted outside of local context in Africa. So solutions came from external powers, colonial powers at that point, that had little or no understanding of local context. So when they imposed solutions in those contexts, they were often short-term, they were extractive, they were focused on benefit to external parties. And as a result, some of the problems that were not resolved that I talk about in my book are still problems today. One of the ongoing problems we have in many African contexts is in land. And those problems are clearly rooted in the colonial context and what happened during those contexts and how problems weren't really solved. So when we talk about solutions, we have to really have an understanding of what the problem is. And the problem is partly an external problem. It's not just a problem internal within many African countries. Now, speaking about the internal, and so when we think about debt, we have to look at debt institutions. We have to look at the Bretton Woods institutions. We have to look at how African countries fit in those kinds of institutions. And we have to look, for instance, Zambia finally has a debt agreement. It took almost 3.5 years under the common framework for Zambia to have a debt agreement. And when we look at how Zambia got to that point, it reflects the combination of external and internal factors. It also reflects increasing levels of complexity. There's a lot of complexity. We have a lot of different countries that are differently positioned. We have a lot of different kinds of creditors today. And one of the things that is really clear in the Zambian situation is trying to figure out, how do you align and deal with private creditors? How do you deal with debt from China? How do you deal with debt that was the kind of debt that used to be more typical 20 years ago, that's no longer a dominant source of indebtedness in many African countries? How do we deal with that complexity? What it requires is flexible solutions that don't just borrow from external sources. They have to be hybrid solutions that take account of, you have to learn from historical experience, but you have to also be rooted in the local context. So I'll end in this first round by talking about the internal. We also have a lot of issues in the internal that reflect colonial hangover. So some of the questions that we have to think about when we think about the intersection of the internal and external is, what kind of incentives do our current structures and institutions create? I don't think they necessarily create incentives to make sure debt is used well and it's used in a sustainable way and incurred in a sustainable way. So when we talk about sustainability, it's not just about the environment. There are also issues about sustainability of policies and sustainability of debt itself. And that's something that's not sufficiently of sufficient focus, because the extractive nature of colonialism as external extraction is reflected internally in many countries in Africa today. And we know that there's a problem of extraction with IFFs and other factors. So one of the things we have to ask is, what kind of incentives are created with debt, and what actually happens to the money? Because if you have debt crisis with money well used, that's an entirely different situation than if you have debt crisis where no one can really explain what the benefit was of the money that was used by which that indebtedness was incurred. And so we have situations like in Mozambique with the debt that was incurred in Mozambique that went to all kinds of places, but not Mozambique. And that's probably one of the more extreme situations, but we have many situations where it's not really clear what the indebtedness was for. So that means, bottom line, we need strategies. We need internal strategies about when we're undertaking debt. What exactly is the goal of that debt? How do we measure success? How do we determine whether there's failure? And we also need sustainability with those strategies that carry over multiple administrations, because one of the key reasons why many African countries undertake debt is for development, for poverty reduction. And you're actually seeing some of the poverty statistics. Actually, we have more people in debt today, and this is partly because of population growth, more people in debt today than we've ever had. And the prospects, given the demographics we see today in many African contexts, the prospects are that there are going to be many more indebted people by the time we hit 2030. So I think we need to think about the internal and external strategies and sustainabilities as being key themes that really are integral to our understanding of how we deal with debt in existing context, as well as in new arenas. And in the next round, I'm going to talk about, we have to also think about what do we mean by innovation. Innovation is not doing new things with old institutions. That's not necessarily very innovative. So we need to really think about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Fumi, for starting us so well and setting quite a number of, I guess, you have set a lot of high expectations about, where you're going to take this next, as you just said in concluding. So bio, we're going to come to you since we know the first round is sort of covering this broad terrain. There's a debate about how to define climate finance. And within the Paris framework and beyond. Some countries want a common definition and want it to be new and additional to already existing commitments. Other countries, particularly the countries in the global north and the ones that call themselves the environmental integrity group, say no. Most countries in the global south, including African, Latin American countries and India, want a common definition and want it to be new and additional to already existing commitments. Why is there a split in this debate about definitions, and what, if anything, does it have to do with the financial obligations, if any, are imposed by the Paris Agreement?
Thank you so much, and I should join Professor Arewa in thanking Afronomicslaw for having us here. I will just jump straight at that question, and I think the key theme of that question is this even a relevant debate around what is climate finance? And the straight answer to that is no. There is a way we contrive challenges, particularly in the climate space. We contrive challenges, we get sucked into unimportant debates, and then it takes the gaze off very, very salient issues. Is there a problem with what is climate finance? No. Over 32 years ago, 1992, the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I will just call it the convention, it's a mouthful. The convention, Article 4, clearly stated what climate finance and what kind of climate finance, that's Article 11, should be. Climate finance should be predictable. Climate finance should be adequate. Climate finance should be tailored to deal with the incremental needs of developing states. Climate finance should be, like I said, predictable. It was clearly stated in Article 4.3, Article 4.4, Article 11 of the 1992 convention. In fact, Article 4.3 clearly also states that climate finance should be new and additional. So what exactly is the debate? And if that is not enough, let's even assume, okay, we are not too sure per source. Is it just grants? Is it just concessional loans? Well, like I said, Article 11 said it is concession and grant. But that has been expanded now by global north countries, developed countries, which I don't quite know the right term for such countries anyway. So-called developed countries, they've stretched that to include export credit, which is quite ridiculous. They've stretched that to include private finance, which they facilitated. And you wonder, how do you measure that? So it again is a contrived challenge, taking the gaze away from more important conversations. And what are the important conversations here? Well, we need a framework, a composite framework that deals with issues of available and adequate finance. That's what we should be talking about. And by the way, when we start talking about new and quantified climate finance by 2025, And the old debate since 2022 is, okay, what exactly would be the quantum? Okay, 100 billion was set as quantum of climate finance in 2009, which should have been met by 2020, $100 billion by per year in climate finance. It has never been met. And now, okay, should we set it at 400 billion or 500 billion? But we don't even need a debate on that. We know what kind and the amount of climate finance that is needed. It's around $2.3 trillion per year. Okay, let's get over that. We know that is it. How do we get there? How do we hit $2.3 trillion per year rather than going back and forth on can we set it at 400 billion or 500 billion, and we will have this debate till 2030 without getting anywhere. So it's a conversation on availability and adequacy. It is a conversation on accountability and transparency. It is a conversation on accessibility. It is a conversation on allocation. These are the conversations we should be having, not how do we define climate finance. It's not, it's distracting, but again, it is strategically distracting.
Okay, thank you very much, Bio. We are going to come back to you so that you can redirect us as you're suggesting. So to my friend Jane now, again, this is sort of round one table setting conversation. Global South leaders have been vocal about the unequal treatment in the African context of African countries with regard to climate funding and the lending system. The Zambian president, together with the Kenyan president, together with the Ghanaian president, recently, if you haven't seen, wrote an editorial in The Economist and argued that there's something fundamentally wrong with the global financial system, and they argued that it must be fixed. In that March 6th editorial in The Economist, which The Economist said they invited the presidents to write, the three presidents stated, quote, "Unsustainable debt is keeping many developing countries from investing in climate and conservation. And innovations, to your point, like debt for nature swaps, debt relief in exchange for green initiatives are part of the solution." How does this idea of using debt for nature swaps sit alongside the reality of the unsustainable debt that we've been hearing about this week?
Okay, thank you so much, James. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much also for inviting me to this very, very interesting conversation and being part of this panel. One, the issue of unequal treatment, and the fact that the global financial system, the lending system, the climate finance system, all of them are stacked against developing countries. In fact, those countries which you have read are in debt default. Zambia is negotiating a debt restructuring. Ghana is in the same boat. So they are right to say that the system, the financial system, is not working for them. But the financial system is working for some people. And I think we need also to understand the narrative when it comes to climate financing. The narrative is that the global south, developing countries, have no resources to address their climate challenges. And the resources are from the global north, but from the private sector, from the corporations, from the global capital, global finance. And that's why there are all these innovations, the debt, the swaps, the debt for nature swaps, the rainbow bonds, the green bonds, the orange bonds, the blue bonds, all of them, they are seeking for investable assets, investable resources. And climate change is one of those lucrative areas for investment. And what's also interesting is that when we talk about climate finance, we are forgetting the climate and we are concentrating on finance, innovative finance. In fact, when you look at the debate around climate financing, we no longer talk about the tipping, that we're on a tipping point, that there are floods. You know, when you look at the UNFCCC, you know, what the doomsday, you know, that, you know, things are bad. We no longer talk about that. We are looking at the money, innovation, the blue bonds, that, you know, it's about money. And so climate change is about money. So our leaders in Africa will go on and on saying it's unfair, but the reality is global capital is restructuring our economies, and global capital is looking for resources for investment. And that's why the green, all these innovative methods of climate financing are not going to work for climate. They are not going to work even for debt, because we are talking about the debt for nature swaps. They are not. All these innovations are going to work for global capital to make more money. But maybe specifically when you look at the debt for nature swaps, there are examples, for example, countries like Belize, countries like Chad, they have been able to negotiate some of these debt to nature swaps. But the outcome is that there is more, it's very complex. I was reading around the example of Belize. Each transaction, so many complex transactions, each transaction is there, companies making more money. Each transaction, more money. So ideally, when you look at the issue of debt to nature swaps, like all the other innovative climate change, innovative financing, it's not going to work. But what we need to agree also is that the nature swaps, debt swaps, can't replace the need for broader debt framework. And I think African leaders are right that financial architecture, the data architecture need to change if we are to address the climate crisis. Thank you.
Yeah. So, thank you so much, Jane, for that, for those comments, which really, I think, set up Fumi's next question, which is, given your skepticism and also her initial skepticism, you know, what should be the key basic considerations before African states subscribe to these innovative climate finance measures? And in answering this question, please tell us, you know, what just accessible and non-debt creating finance that is based on the needs of African countries, the kind of finance that might make Jane happy so that she can live here smiling, might look like. Because right now, I don't see the smile on her face.
That's a tall order. I can begin to address the question. I mean, I think that there's a general question about what is innovative and what's innovative about it. So if we think about climate finance, the question, and this is a persistent thing that I think has been an issue historically with borrowings in African contexts, whether it be in finance, policies, laws. The question is, where is it coming from? And there's some basic empirical questions. For instance, does it actually work? A lot of my work has been about legal borrowings, and people, you can often tell in different African contexts about when you look at a legal borrowing about where the expert came from, because everyone thinks their own legal system works. But as we know, if we look at the context of the US legal system, there are a lot of aspects of our legal system that don't actually work very well. We're quite happy to export those and offer those aspects of our legal system as solutions for elsewhere in the world. So I think there needs to be a skepticism with any new thing that is being proposed, and there needs to be an internal dialogue about, well, does this actually work wherever it's coming from? That should be a first question. And then as we import it, what can we learn from what went wrong wherever it came from? Because there's no such thing as a perfect innovation. If it's innovative, innovation takes a long time. Innovation requires failure. If you're really going to innovate, you have to go down many paths that might lead to failure. So the first thing you should say if we're doing something innovative is maybe take an experimental approach, because if it's actually innovative, the chances of failure, I would suggest, are quite high. So the question is, how do you think places where I've practiced law, like Silicon Valley, there's a lot of failure. 90% of startups, an estimated 90% of startups actually fail. So if we're really going to do innovation, we should expect a lot of failure. And the question is, who should be bearing the risks of those failure? And one of the things I argue in my recent chapter about debt is that I think the incentives, when we look at sovereign debt, the incentives are not properly aligned, because many creditors don't really want to bear risk of loss. If you're a creditor, part of being a creditor, if you're investing in, and part of the risk the creditor should bear is if in fact you invest in something that was not a good investment for whatever reason, you as a creditor, if you're as a debt investor or an equity investor, you bear the risk of failure. And I think part of the problem in the sovereign debt context is creditors don't really bear the kind of risk they should be bearing, because I think in many contexts, what I argue in my chapters, you don't have first of all, choice of law. And I think Anna Gelperin has done some really interesting work. Choice of law is almost always New York or England. So that means that choice of law is not local. So that means if you're someone from the country that's issuing the debt, you actually have to go to England, go to London, or go to New York to actually litigate this debt. You have a lot of the creditors are private equity investors, and they have very different incentives than the kind of investors we've had traditionally in this space. They're not the same as bilateral or even multilateral, and I don't want to say investors, people who are giving debt in this space. So I think there's a lot of, when we think about innovation is not something I'm sure you want to fund with debt, because innovation is very risky. Typically, debt is for less risky things. So the question may be, how do you think about ways to properly finance different types of initiatives, some of which are highly risky, some of which aren't? If it's highly risky, I would suggest we maybe need different policy approaches that are based in sustainability and maybe being more incremental, experimental, rather than throwing a lot of money at it and seeing it fail. So I think we really need to reorient. If it's really innovation, we need to reorient how we think about financing it. And I think we need to make a decision about what you're financing with debt, what is our expected return on whatever it is we're financing, and what are we going to finance internally, what's going to be external, what's going to be internal, because I think there's a lot that could come to the table from within Africa that's leaving the continent. And that's why in my remarks I mentioned IFFs. African countries, actually, if you add all the numbers up, some people would suggest, however you want to, if you want to think about it as flows or balance sheet, there's actually a lot of money that's leaving African context. Some of it has to do with transfer pricing. It's a complicated issue, but I think we really need to delve into the complexity. Finance is complex today. The topography of creditors and investors is complex today. And I think we need to think about investing much more systematically and thinking about how do you think about success and failure in that context, with recognition that some things will fail. And if there's a high risk of failure, I think we really need to question if that is something that should be financed with external debt in particular. I don't have answers, but I think we need to start to maybe think about this a little differently, especially if we're talking about innovation. And I think in many contexts, we're not talking about innovation because and I think we also don't have proper alignment of incentives. And I really want to highlight this fact of some of the external debt credit holders, especially the private investors, I don't really think are bearing the kind of risk that they should be bearing, because they're the best positioned people to make a determination about whether they should be giving debt. And they're the best positioned people to monitor the debt, because in many countries internally, there's little ability to actually monitor debt when it's given and to make sure it's being used for the stated purpose. Creditors could do that. If that means less debt, maybe that's what we need. But I think if we align the incentives better, we would have better outcomes, or potentially.
Okay, so I thought I was going to get good answers, but this is complicated. It's complex. There are risks. I thought innovation is supposed to be progressive. So, when a lawyer hears all those things, Bio, I'm coming to you because I think now we have to think about the law. This is too complicated. Um, so, escaping to the law for a bit to see whether this provides us the cover. Do the states that are most responsible for the climate crisis have legal or even moral responsibilities for addressing the climate crisis? My premise here, obviously, if we get that answer right, then all this complexity is, besides the point. And why is anchoring the discussions on climate finance in the binding nature of state responsibility important? So I know you're an environmental lawyer, international lawyer. Please help us so that we don't have to deal with all this complexity and uncertainty and risks.
Well, let me disappoint you.
Oh my God.
Okay, I won't. The answer to the question of is there a legally binding obligation on the international climate change law on climate finance is straightforward. For developed countries, yes. But the follow-up is, so what? Article 9, Paris Agreement, Article 4, 1992 Convention clearly states that developed countries have the obligation to provide climate finance to developing countries. So, yes, but so, of course, we could then throw ourselves into the weeds of that answer. Like, okay, are we just talking about Article 9 of the Paris Agreement? How do we define developed countries in Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement? And I started, my first response was on strategic ambiguity, right? That the way we deliberately, I shouldn't say we, developed countries deliberately mucky the field and then throw us back into debate arenas, issues that we've already resolved, and then we fight over it for 3, 4, 5 more years. Professor Okafo had spoken about the idea of newness over 20 years ago, right? They throw us back, and then we think we've gotten a new concept, but nothing comes from it. So Article 9.1 says developed countries have a binding obligation under international climate law. Who are the developed countries? Well, that should have been resolved because 1992 convention provides a list called the Annex 2 countries. They should be the developed countries. And Article 9 clearly incorporates by reference to the 1992 convention. Article 9.1 says, well, the developed countries will provide climate finance in furtherance of their obligation under the 1992 convention. So if you were to just interpret that on the face, you would say, well, the Annex 2 list has clarified where finance should come from. It should come from the listed 25 to 30 developed countries. But developed countries would tell you, no, Article 4 has been overtaken by Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. So we are thrown back into that cycle again. And one of the debates we now need to have is, who are the developed countries? Who are the developing countries? So again, on the face of it, the answer is yes, there is an obligation, but deliberately we've also been thrown into that contrived murky space again, where we need to now debate over who exactly is China developed or developing. Well, if you ask the World Bank has a list of some 30 countries as developed. Then countries like China, countries like Korea, countries like Turkey are considered developing, right? So again, and I think this is something I will come back to. Probably we should stop placing too much emphasis on the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. We should take what we have currently as there is no longer an homogenized regime for climate change or climate finance. It is very heterogeneous. It is very politicized. It is everywhere. And that goes back to the issue of complexity that we began to speak about. So bottom line, there is a binding obligation under international climate law. Developed countries should have that responsibility, but it has amounted to nothing real time, real life.
I thought you're going to solve our problems. So I'm going to run away from the lawyers now because you are not helping this debate. But this is very helpful, actually, on a serious note. So Jane, now we sort of, I think the lawyers are not helping us, to be honest. So, you work in multiple areas in international economic law. And as you know, in this area of climate finance, there are also multiple venues where this is being considered, debated, crafted. The IMF, the World Bank, the G20, Bridgetown, or as we call it here at Afronomicslaw, Bridgetown 2, the African Club proposed by the African presidents, and so on and so forth. And this focus in these multiple venues, do you think it's overshadowing the non-debt creating finance that you and Fumi were speaking about, and other significant questions like debt cancellation? I see Jason Braganza in the room, and also holding private creditors responsible, which I think Fumi hinted at, so that they also bear the risks that they assume, and those risks are not one-sided. In short, what would just accessible finance that is responsive to the poorest countries and their communities that are significantly affected by the climate crisis look like?
Okay, thank you so much, James. And thanks also, for what you have raised about the binding commitments, And I think that debate has been on, and the promises have been on. I remember in was it COP 17 when they said 100 billion, we never saw the money. But I have seen broken promises by developed countries. Recently, I was in the World Trade Organization, the ministerial conference in the WTO, where you see the US, they don't care what has been agreed on, what's in the treaties. They just go do what they want. So again, when we extrapolate that to the climate finance, it's the same. They are broken promises, whether it's binding in the UNFCCC, we are not going to get that money. And I think to continue talking about what they owe us, what they should do, there are also issues around even the ecological debt, that, it's the developed countries through their industrialization who have polluted, and they owe southern countries an ecological debt. All that, we know it, and it's very binding, but they are not going to do it. So, James, when we talk about all this financing in the IMF, World Bank, in the G20, it overshadows other alternatives, which we should be looking at. My colleague Jason will tell you debt cancellation might not be on the table given the structure of the debt. I don't know whether we need to pursue that, but that's also an option on the table. The issue of ensuring that the lenders and the debtors are responsible, we should be putting it on the table. So there are so many issues we should be putting on the table. But I think one of the most important issues is the issue of how we can be able to generate our own resources internally. And we are not discussing that, because when we are talking about climate change and energy transition, because the two are going together, energy transition to a low carbon economy, we are talking about using the critical minerals, because that's also on the table, critical minerals, and most of them are in Africa. But we are not talking about that we can be able to add value to our minerals. We can be able to use those resources to address our climate challenges. We are not discussing that. Kwame, you have talked about the outflow of resources. In fact, if developed countries can just stop giving us the money, but also stop extracting, Africa would be up and dry. We could be able to address our climate crisis. But because we have put in a narrow path of looking at innovative financing, we are looking at the bonds, we are looking at the swaps, our energy is on that innovative financing. But the innovative financing is going to create more debt, more indebtedness, because, for example, the bonds, the green bonds, that's more debt. Even these swaps, the debt to the nature swaps, all that is debt creating. So for me, if we are to look at how to have a sustainable climate financing which is not debt creating, we have to generate resources internally. And I think lastly on this issue, because that's why when you look at the HIPIC initiative was that initiative when the debt, that was 19 what? HIPIC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, where developed 2000, where poor countries were forgiven, debt cancellation. Within no time, the debt had accumulated again, and this is where we are, because this debt was cancelled at one time, but this is where we are. And the reason was that we looked at debt on its own, cancel that debt, but we cancel that debt, yet we are still commodity dependent. My country exports coffee, and coffee, the price is going up and down, and we get just peanuts from our coffee. Ghana exports cocoa. The people who are producing cocoa can't even afford to buy a bowl of chocolate from Switzerland. So that's how our economy is. Unless we structurally transform our economy, we can't be able to address the climate crisis. And we'll continue looking outside Africa for financing, and financing which is debt creating. So we need to look inwards in Africa to look at alternatives for climate financing. Thank you.
You can just hold on. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to still be coming back to you because this is going to be the last round before we come to you, the audience. So I hope you have your questions ready. I think we're doing well on time. And now we are back to Fumi on a very related question to the question that Jane was just addressing about debt restructurings. You already mentioned that Zambia took almost 3.5 years to go through the common framework. And as we know with the Zambia restructuring deal, it didn't really deliver real savings for Zambia. It was, as you said, very complicated because there were many layers of creditors. And the last creditors were holding out were, of course, the private creditors. How can African countries generally meet the financially high costs of renewable energy and all the other climate-related financial needs without sinking into further debt distress? I mean, given what especially Jane was mentioning, HIPIC really was a maybe perhaps a mirage. I mean, there wasn't much private creditor. It was mostly official creditors, not private creditors. And they had to do with the Financial Standards Accounting Board for the private creditors. They had to sort of do some accounting gymnastics for the private creditors to reflect, not reflect huge losses on their books. But in any event, yes. I'm looking for solutions now, especially because we're about to turn to the audience. I'm sure they're going to be saying, you raised so many questions, so many problems, what are the solutions?
I'm not sure, I'm going to start out by saying I'm not sure I'll have the solutions, but I can talk about approaches. I think one of the things we need to think about is policy innovation, because I think what Jane describes reflects a lack of policy innovation. And I want to talk about just a couple of things. One is governance, which I know is a widely used term, but I want to talk about governance and transparency, because one of the things that was most interesting about the Zambian case is that it turned out that a lot of their debt was, at least some portion of their debt was hidden. And it came out in the course of the negotiations that they had actually had more debt than was reported. So there's some real issues of transparency in debt. And Zambia actually had a lot of debt relative to most other countries in Africa prior to their default. And they actually had a lot of private creditor debt. And I think what it requires is really going back to my discussion about strategy and policy. And I also want to follow up on Jane's discussion about internally. The external configurations may not be changing in terms of the external configurations. There's a remarkable continuity from colonialism till current times in terms of patterns of exclusion, extraction. But one place that change could be attempted, innovative policies could be attempted, is internally. And I think some of the things internally that might be thought about, and I'm not the first person to raise these, is governance and transparency. How do we create sustainable institutions, policies, laws, approaches that serve the interest of local people? Thinking about things like renewable energy. What kind of renewable energy strategies make sense in the African context? I mean, when we look at Nigeria, Nigeria is having electricity meltdown after electricity meltdown. It's happening not only in Nigeria, it's called different things in different places, load shedding in South Africa, but electricity shouldn't be so difficult, right? That's a question of how do you organize, and electricity, there's a complexity of governance that requires interfacing among different institutions. And I think that's where we see systematic problems over time. Sometimes people can get it together for a while, but making that sustainable continues to be challenging. And in my book, I talk about some of that is rooted in colonialism, some of it is rooted in post-colonial governance decisions that have not really been effective or good, I think, in my view. So I think when we think about we need new models and new approaches and new policies with an idea of how do we remix. We can learn a lot from the experience of the external, but we can think about remixing them. So using models selectively rather than taking models as a whole. And that means questioning. When someone says this is what the policy should be, it should be questioned. And you have to think about, if you're not questioning and changing it, there's not local input. If it's being implemented as, wholly as conceived of externally, it's unlikely to be successful in many respects. And I think one of the things we really need to focus on is developing internal capacity, so that a lot of things can be done internally, because African countries could be a key source of global innovation about how do you do things efficiently, effectively, and at the same time address questions related to poverty, which remain endemic in many African countries. And I think we also need to think about measurement. How do you focus on measuring policies? Because one of the things we don't do as lawyers often is study outcomes. What we learn in law school, the law schools, is that you learn about arguments. But even as lawyers, we often don't know how effective the legal policies we adopt actually are. I think in African context, with the limited resources, you have to be much smarter have smarter policy that's measured and that's effective. And I think we also need to embrace complexity along multiple axes. So for instance, we talked about how we have this, even with the heavily indebted poor countries, they soon came to be in a lot of debt again. But it also highlights one of the things we see with the most recent cycle of debt, where we have a lot of Eurobond debt that's been issued, is we really see a failure to make connections between finance and debt policy, monetary and exchange rate policies. And then if we're thinking about things like innovation in energy policy, technology policy, poverty reduction and development goals, export-import strategies, like what is our model? Ghana notably has said we're going to try to harness more local value added with cocoa, for instance. That's something that a lot of countries could think about doing. And Nigeria is finally, the Dangote refinery finally came online. So Nigeria is actually, should be able in the near future to actually refine fuel rather than exporting raw fuel and importing refined fuel. But there are a lot of places where the reason there's debt, the reason there's a need is that we could have smarter, more interconnected policies that could actually try to address some of these issues. And I think it does require rethinking how we think about the internal, how we think about the local, especially from a policy perspective. And it also requires thinking, really not valuing the external as having more validity than local innovation, because a lot of innovation really needs to be based on, to a greater extent, on local innovation. And how we do that is, I think, will require some thinking, but I think we need the mindset to say that local innovation is key.
So can you add 2 sentences to that answer about the role of African regional institutions like Afrexim Bank, African Development Bank? I won't mention the AFCFTA or the trade stuff.
Well, I think the local, when I think of local, I mean local within actual sub-regional. I mean, I think within subnational. So I think that's ultimately the most local, national, regional, and pan-African. And I think they all have a role. And I think it's really important. And we've seen, for instance, in the health area with vaccine policy and with vaccine sort of underlying R&D issues, patents, we've seen a big regional and pan-African sort of focus on that makes me hopeful that the next time we have a pandemic, there'll be African countries will be able to actually get access to vaccines and actually manufacture vaccines locally to a greater extent. Because during COVID, one of the things that became apparent was the lack of local capacity to really manufacture vaccine within African context. So I think the health sector shows us the key importance of the local, the subnational, national, local, and regional as well. And I think that's a key role. And I think I would highlight the Africa Centers for Disease Control as being as having a potential for a model.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Jane, I'm going to now come back to you. You told us that one solution is to generate our own resources internally, which the two of you have been very emphatic on that point. But when I look around, and I'm not going to cite the statistics, I see African governments ceding huge swaths of their land to carbon credit investors. Some countries up to 20% of their entire forest land. And this is a trend across the continent. What implications does this have for debt and climate crisis and the people whose livelihoods and homes are affected by these transactions?
Okay, thank you so much, James. Again, the carbon credits, carbon sinks, that's also another private sector-based solution, money-making solution. Again, packaging nature for business, and it won't address the climate crisis. In fact, carbon credits is a license to pollute, because what happens, a private company goes to Africa, negotiates, gets a huge forest, pays some little money, sells those credits to another company somewhere to continue polluting. And I think we need to remember that we are talking about a climate crisis, a climate crisis. Now you are talking about UNFCCC has said if we don't reduce the temperatures by 1.5%, things are going to go bad. We need to remember that, but we are forgetting about it, looking at money, carbon credits. Carbon credits are not going to address the climate crisis. It's going to make it worse. And then two, it's also going to make it worse for the communities who are on that land. I have seen some carbon credit businesses and negotiations. The people are not there. There's no transparency. We even don't know how much they are giving governments. So it's a mess. It's a mess out there. So maybe the people who are benefiting are African leaders, some who are pocketing this money. Then the corporations, the big corporations, because it's big businesses. But the rest, the climate, is not going to benefit. The people are not going to benefit. And even the countries, this money is not going to help us to get out of poverty. So it's not helping the dead, it's not helping the communities, it's not helping the environment. So we need to rethink the whole issue. For Africa, we need to rethink the whole issue of the carbon credit. It would be a solution if it's not a license to pollute, if it's designed properly, that the forests are conserved, they are carbon, maybe they become carbon sinks, and the governments are paid, reasonably to offset their debt, but it needs to be thought out. Before I end, I wanted to go back to that issue which Kumi raised about looking at internally in Africa, issues of governance, issues of transparency. I agree entirely. It's like walking on two legs. You need to look at internally the challenges and address them, but we need to look at the external factors. The entire global financial architecture is wrong. That debt architecture is wrong for Africa, for developing countries. You just look at the interest rates which African countries are giving, and the interest rates for developed countries. It's already unfair. When you look at the fact that we borrow in euro, in the euro bonds, we borrow in foreign currency, yet we are earning in local currencies, which are fluctuating all that time, So we need to add, in fact, when you talk about transparency, even if we are transparent, even if Zambia was transparent, it doesn't change the indebtedness where they are. Yet, if we address the global financial architecture and debt architecture, it would have a lot of difference on the debt crisis. Thank you.
Okay, so I told you Jane challenges me. We just filed a case in the East African Court of Justice on transparency of the planned debt swaps in Kenya. So maybe perhaps we should withdraw that suit based on these comments. But our next event is going to be talking about that case when we announce that case, which we just filed this week. So Bio, the last question before we open up to the audience, you better make sure this is good, because the questions from this audience, I can tell you, will not be easy. So in some of the recent work that the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network has done, including the book out there, which I invite everybody to take a copy, a book which you co-edited, you and some of the authors used the term neoliberal environmentalism. What does it mean? And how does it offer solutions in a specific context now to even open the floor even wider on the question of critical mineral rich for countries that have critical mineral countries in Africa and in other parts of the global south? So sort of expanding sort of the themes to focus on that just before we open up for the audience. And also for the audience, there's a reception in the room next door after we finish, so don't be in a hurry.
Basically, neoliberal environmentalism suggests that you can solve a problem through the mindset that created it. Forget that industrial revolution and the rise of capitalism and the markets taking the lead throughout the globe contributed to climate change and at the very core of rise in greenhouse gas emissions. Forget that fingers should be pointed squarely at capitalism. Neoliberal environmentalism says, let us run back to capitalism to solve the climate crisis. Let us centralize the market. Let us put the market in the driver's seat in searching for the solution. And that's virtually everything we've been talking about. It is nature for climate swap. It's that idea that the market can be in the driver's seat. It's the idea of carbon credit. It's the idea of Article 6 and voluntary measures. And it's the idea that if the World Bank does not lead this conversation, there is no way we will solve the climate problem. It's the idea that private financial institutions must be at the driver's seat. It's the idea that it shouldn't be about grants, it shouldn't be about consortium. No, leave it to the forces of the market, and they are the savior. No, they didn't just set the house ablaze. They are the firefighters. That is the idea of neoliberal environmentalism. Let capitalism help solve the climate crisis that capitalism caused. And that goes back to the idea of innovation as well. And takes me, and I will just end with this. Can we really talk about institutional and instrumental innovation while not talking about normative innovation, particularly in respect to climate change? Normative innovation is how we think about this problem. Instrumental innovation says we should bring up the issue of climate or nature for debt swap, which, by the way, is not new. Agenda 21 add nature for, and Agenda 21, by the way, was in 1992. Add nature for debt swap and these other innovative financing instruments.
So I won't even ask you about sustainable development. I don't want to provoke you any further. So I know those are fighting words for you. So now I see that a gentleman I call the Emperor has put a microphone at the back there. You can either line up, or we're willing to give up a microphone from up here. But if you have no questions, there's a great reception with some great drinks and food waiting for us in the next room. I'm happy to shepherd us there.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, panel, for what I believe is a very provocative session on climate finance and sovereign debt. I see that the center of the discussion is on basically Africa, of course, and the developing countries. My name is Vincent Mehele. I speak in my personal capacity, not as the Secretary General of the African Development Bank. I just wanted to recall a few things to be able, I'm not asking questions, I'm making a few comments. To recall a few things so that we can begin to see how difficult this discussion is. In 2009, at COP15, the world said, the developed world said, or committed to mobilizing, that they will mobilize $100 billion by 2020 per annum to address climate change issues in the developing world. Okay? Today is 2024, right? Has any amount been mobilized? Zero. At COP28 in the Emirates, just happened last November, the same debate about 100 billion. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the whole idea was, okay, there is an agreement towards that, and nobody has seen a cent, and that's the reason why the three presidents wrote what they wrote in the economics. So I'm just trying to lay a background to that. Are you sure that any money will come, even in 20 years' time? I can assure you that it's not going to happen. I'm sitting where I sit. Now the question becomes, Jane, is your name right?
Jane.
It's Jane, yeah. I think she drills down the point as to what does Africa do for itself. At the end of the day, domestic resource mobilization is the way to go. And making sure that the necessary tax is paid by these multinational corporations for Africa's development. And those are some of the difficulties we have. Now, the 100 billion that will be mobilized, nobody says what it's going to be for. Is it grants or is it loan? It will not be grants. If it's going to be grants, it's going to be grants within the framework of either World Bank, either or the African Development Bank's African Development Funds window to poor countries. And those grants are not much. And so no country can develop with that. So the problem persists. And when we talk about Africa's new green minerals that we all talk about, do we have the resources, the technology, and the skills to be able to deal with it? It still depends on other people, and they come and they don't pay tax or appropriate tax. So it's a whole lot more. And debt for nature swaps, what does it mean? Or we're owing you a lot of money, don't pay a bit of that. Use part of that and invest in areas that are going to promote conservation of the environment. And who comes to do the work? People from the other side will come to do the work, and still the money will go to somewhere else. So I think the issue is around how do developing countries mobilize themselves to deal with their problems, because nobody's going to deal with your problem at the end of the day. After the so-called multilateral arrangements, there will be bilateral arrangements with some countries who will also take their own pound of flesh from the aspects of debt. So we are really faced with a whole lot of difficulties. The question as to restructuring the global financial architecture becomes very, very relevant. And I invite you to the African Development Bank's annual meetings that will be holding in Nairobi, the 27th of October to the 31st. And the theme is transforming Africa's development, the African Development Bank, and the reform of the global financial architecture, because these debates will be holding. So there's a lot of questions, but the solutions are not easy, because there are a lot of variables that will determine how far we go. And Africa is always for example, we are advocating for the rechanneling of SDRs through development banks to be able to reach the poor developing country citizens, because we can leverage that money channel by making $1 to $4 and have more finances available to developing countries, but it's being kicked against by the developed world. So what is the credibility in the entire process? So James, you will not be finding a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please introduce yourself.
It's okay. Thanks. May I?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Keith Martin, the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. I'm going to make a plea for assistance, but it's not for money. So on the heels of my colleague here, the promises that are made in terms of finance that are promised, that's just magical thinking, right? History bears it out. It's just not going to happen. But not only do we have a climate crisis, but we have a biodiversity crisis that are absolutely intertwined. And both are existential threats to the social and economic well-being of people around the world, but particularly in low-resource countries. But I wanted just to posit that as an opportunity. We have a consortium of 200 academic institutions around the world. We work with one group that has 70 academic institutions in sub-Saharan Africa. Here's our challenge that we really need your help in. We know in order to operationalize and be able to utilize the natural capital on the continent, which is more than any other continent that everybody knows, right? 40% of natural resources, incredible natural capital, an incredible source of that can be sustainably utilized for the social determinants of health that meet the objectives of a number of governments. The challenge that we're faced with, and we really appreciate your guidance and those of others, is in the area of capacity building in the public service, so that governments can have the the trained people within their various ministries that can help to operationalize the programs they want, including in finance and law, to deal with the wholesale theft of billions and billions of dollars off the continent every single year, right? And to deal with this colonization that's stealing, right, vast swaths of land and resources off the continent every single year. But in order to offset that, to deal with the corruption, to strengthen government's capacity to do that, our challenge, and we'd love your guidance on this, is how can we strengthen the government's capacity to do this, particularly utilizing academic institutions within their own country that are a resource of people. How can we incentivize and be able to enable those African institutions to work with their own governments to build up their capacity to be able to strengthen their delivery of programs in their own country to address the climate biodiversity crisis? In doing so, I think they'll be able to generate the resources as well as having the capacity to deliver the public programs that are necessary. So would really appreciate your guidance on how to do that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so two great questions. So we will take a very quick, very quick round of responses. Oh, one more?
Let them respond. Let them respond.
No, it's important from you. By our culture,
There's
we
a
will
reason
take
why-
a female question at the same time. So let's go on to you now.
All right. So I'm Japa Dawoni, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. And there's a reason why I want to speak after they've responded. So can I defer to them to answer, then I come in, according to the new culture I just created?
The new male culture. Okay. Fumi. Very brief.
Briefly, I agree it's very complicated, but I think we have to think about what kind of strategy we need to follow, and I think it requires parallel internal and external strategies. Because the global financial system, if we're waiting for that to change, to reform internally, our grandchildren will be talking about, we'll be having the same conversation. So I think we do need to address the internal and the external simultaneously. And I think if the changes within, I mean, one of the things, I just read the editorial in The Economist right now, because I hadn't read it. One of the things they talk about in that editorial is the need for internal African innovation to address some of these issues in internal financing. And that can be done regardless of what's happening externally, at least on a small scale, perhaps at first, but that can be a start. But I think this is basically in part a problem of what kind of how do you disrupt these internal and external patterns? How do you disrupt them? It requires some kind of sustained strategy that may take generations. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. And the question is, where do you start? And I think that's a key challenge.
Jane, you were invoked by the Secretary General of the ADB, although he said he's speaking in his personal capacity.
Okay. So I won't say Secretary General. I will say Mr. Vincent. I agree entirely to what you raised. The issue of domestic resource mobilization, the issue of structural transformation is very critical. And I think we need to look at what kind of policies do we need to be able to structurally transform our economies. Policies around trade, around investment, around industry, because, for example, now the industrial policy is back on the agenda. You know, US is talking about industrial policy. In Africa, we deindustrialized. We are not talking about industrialization. So we need to, and for me, I think the starting point should be structural transformation and what needs to be done. And then we look at the finances and the financing instruments, which can be able to help us to structurally transform our economies. But the challenge which I see throughout the debates, I have been at the IMF World Bank debates, we are looking at finance, like we are looking at it in the vacuum. What are the innovative financing? But for what? Because the purpose will determine how innovative that financing mechanism is. So we need to turn the debate on its head. Start with what do we want? What do our economies want to move from where we are to an economy which is industrialized, where we have backward and forward linkages, where we can be able to export value-added products, industrialized products, where we can be able to have decent jobs. Then we look at the financing mechanisms. But the challenge, James, is we are starting with a finance. And it's deliberate that looking at finance because of the phenomenon of financialization, where our economies have been restructured, where everything, every facet of life, all nature, climate, food, agriculture has become an investable asset. And I think we need to say no to that. Thank you.
Yes.
African countries can't do this alone. And I mean as individual entities. It is massive, it is big. It is called the crisis of the century, millennium, for a reason. So at the very minimum, at 2 levels, we must find a way to bring African countries together. One, at the level of setting up centers of excellence on at core R&D. We, Nigeria alone, or South Africa even, or Kenya, cannot face, say, Glencore. Glencore is massive. To do that, they need to come together, bring their market forces together, bring their financial forces together, bring their intellectual forces together, and let us establish the centers of excellence. And probably, because there's nothing we can do about it, it is a competitive world. For them to stand a chance of surviving that competitive terrain, we need African countries to come together, set up centers of excellence. Let's go into R&D and let us find a way to disrupt this marketized climate market. That's one. Number 2 is also collectively saying or taking a normative stance on some of these issues consistently and coherently. I like it when the AFDB president said no, for example. I don't know if that's the policy of the AFDB currently, but said no to collateralized resources, using natural resources as collateral, which is, that was a good stance. But we need to say no to nature for climate swap, but it seems AFDB is a fan of that. AFDB is a part of the Lobito corridor. Zambia, the United States, EU, raw critical minerals mined to go process elsewhere. We need to say coherent no, consistent no at the normative level.
So just as a point of privilege, I think the Secretary General will allow me to say that when he was the legal counsel of the African Union, he organized to make sure that the 0 draft of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement had these ideas at the very, very, very center. And in fact, the original idea, as one of the 0 draft brought by Vince and many other Africans, was that we were not going to build an African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was going to be separate and apart from the African Union, but was going to use the existing infrastructure, because the whole idea of African solutions for African problems was at the very center of that original thinking. We know that's not what happened later on. The Africa Climate Summit organized by the government of Kenya was basically run by McKinsey, to the point about knowledge production. This is not a conspiracy theory, it's the truth. There are African experts in Africa who could have ran that conference. I am sure the conference in October, the African Development Bank is going to be running, is not going to be run by McKinsey. And I think, so it's not that Africa doesn't have the expertise. It is the question is where the expertise comes from and what the ideas that actually end up being implemented. Anyway, Japa, Professor Demone.
All right, thank you. So once again, thank you, Afronomicslaw and AFSDJN, for this wonderful discussion and collaboration. It's been great listening to you all, and of course to everyone in the room. I am someone who, so positionality, I'm someone who tries on good news. And so far, I haven't heard any good news. I don't know how I'm going to go home. I don't know how I'm going to drive. I don't know how I'm going to sleep, and I don't know what's going to happen. And I know James has been challenging all of you to provide some good news. But of course, you can't provide the good news we want if there's no good news. But that's not to say there's no good news. There's, of course, a lot of innovation. There's a lot of stuff going on across the continent. So I've been reading too much on something called the Third World Approaches to International Law. Some of you may know about it. Two words that stand out of 12, and Obi Okafor is here, James, I'm reading all their works, it's a radical movement. So those two words are what I'm going to lie on today and propose 3 solutions, 3 happy solutions, because you all haven't given me something good. So I'm going to come up with these 3 happy, radical solutions, which by the end of the day, I may look like a fool to some of you. I may look like a citizen of the country called Utopia. Whatever it is, bring it on. So these are the 3 solutions to the Africa debt crisis and the climate change issues. The first solution I'm borrowing from Jane, which was your radical approach: don't take, don't give, hashtag. Yeah, so Jane's don't take, don't give, hashtag don't take, don't give. Don't take our resources, don't give us money. Let us do it. That sounds great. The second one, it's innovative, coming from Fumi. And this is the innovation of creating a totally new African nation. I don't know where it's going to be located. I don't know where we're going to get the land. We have to sign good binding agreements so we don't replicate Gaza issues going on. But let's create a new African nation, because we are tired of listening to all these proposals. We have the experts here on this stage and here and everywhere else. So why can't we create a totally new nation and start from scratch, so that hopefully we're not bound by the negative history of the past? We create a new history. So that's a radical one. Let's create our nation. And then the third solution, it's also innovative. Let women lead this new nation. For 50-something years, going on 60 and 70, since we gained independence, men have been leading African nations, starting with my own country, Ghana. I appreciate Nkrumah. He was a feminist to some extent. Some would argue, what have the men done for us lately? So let women lead in this new nation we call Ethiopia. So hashtag don't take, don't give. Hashtag innovative African new nation to be somewhere on the island, I don't know where on the continent. So we can say this nation and stop saying African nations and let the women lead. Thank you.
Professor Daomi leads the Institute of African Women in Law as well. It's a very fantastic organization you should check out.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Prof. I agree, let women lead. My name is Ugo. I run a media outfit out of Nigeria called Nairametrics. And I'm just listening to you all and really gained a lot. But just curious to know, what do you think the role of media is here to drive the discussion? Because I kind of feel from where I'm from, Nigerians, the poor people, the citizens, people who read a lot of our content, seem more interested in discussions around inflation, discussions around exchange rate, discussions around politics, poverty. Those are the kind of things that interest them from the data we have. So when you start to mention things like climate change, climate finance, it sounds very esoteric. So is it because maybe it's not a lot of education, or there's not just enough content there, or perhaps absence of thought leadership? So how do you think media should play a role here? Because we are quite a veritable tool for disseminating information, at least at the granular level. So just curious to know. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, James, to Afronomicslaw and the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network for organizing this. My name is Jason Braganza. I work with the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. So just 3 questions. I'd just like to get reflections from the panel on. The first one is on the non-debt instruments that could be used to finance the climate crisis or the energy transition. What are your reflections on the idea of a polluter's tax that specifically targets foreign multinational corporations operating in Africa? I know there's different discussions that are trying to explore this idea, and though there is this challenge around the discriminatory prospect that a polluter's tax might have, but I wonder whether this is something that, from a legal perspective, could be considered applied in one way or another. The second one is really linking the perpetrators of the climate crisis from a human rights perspective. Is there a legal case or argument that could be made for something? It's a concept I came across in Addis Ababa during the recent summit called ecocide. So it is the sort of gradual distraction of ecosystems. So in the same way you'd have it, the equivalent for human beings, this is with regards to ecosystems and the environment. And in the nomenclature, and I think, Adebayo has talked about the normative intellectualization of these different concepts and thinking outside the box. Is this something that, from a legal perspective, we could start thinking about in terms of trying to change how we look at our approaches to this? And then lastly, just the reflections on when we're thinking about climate finance and issues of sovereign debt. We cannot think of them in isolation. We work and operate in a system that requires trade, it requires commerce, it requires financial movement of financial flows. And so if there is a system whereby, for example, that prevents that from happening, and I'd like, again, to hear your thoughts about, for example, the US's Inflation Reduction Act or the European Union's carbon-based adjustment mechanism. You've talked about neoliberal environmentalism, where you leave it to markets to deal with it, but the perpetrators of the problem are actually looking inward and doing the opposite of that neoliberal environmentalism and actually embarking on protectionism as a way of preventing African economies specifically, but global South countries more broadly, from moving up the value chain and supply chain and exporting to the rest of the global system. So I wonder, again, just from the legal perspective, whether there are options there that we can, as Africans, challenge the normative that is currently prevailing. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to allow one last quick intervention because Professor Fumi has to go to class. Sorry. You be fast.
Okay.
In 2 minutes. Yeah, you can be fast. Let her intervene because she has to go to class. Sorry.
I apologize in advance for leaving early. I think the questions we just heard highlight some of the challenges, because when we talk about climate finance, there's actually not a lot of involvement in African context yet in terms of climate finance relative to the broader sovereign debt issue. I think one of the challenges we have, going back to the question about media, is how do we draw connections between finance and practical realities on the ground? And I think that's really critical for understanding. So when people are concerned about poverty, if you're poor, you're very concerned about poverty. Finance sounds like something that's not relevant. So we have to, even though we're academics, I think we have to talk about the practical realities of what this really means in the long term, what this extractive system within which African countries are enmeshed, what that means for day-to-day living of people on the continent, everyday people on the continent. And I think it's incumbent upon us to draw those connections. They may seem obvious to us, but I think we need to highlight that and talk about them. And that's why interventions like the Economist editorial are important. That's not for an everyday audience. There's an audience on the ground within countries, but there's also a broader global audience that has a lot of misconceptions about Africa. We just have to be honest about African people, and those play a role in how people think about policy. And we always have to think about that. And that's why I think media is very important on multiple levels.
Okay, so you have to go?
I have to go.
Please join me in thanking
Thank you.
Professor. Your students are very lucky to have you, and we are very delighted to have benefited from your time here. We shall keep in touch, and we shall not drop the innovation ball, and neither the internal or external. Have a good evening. Maybe we can allow, should we, these two questions, and then we do the last round of responses, because there is a very good reception waiting for us right across the hallway. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to our panelists and everyone attending here. This has been a great session. My name is Chiamaka, and I'm a 2L at Georgetown Law Center. And so just to inform a little bit about the question that I have today is I recently wrote a paper for a bankruptcy seminar titled Systemic Racism, Colonialism, and Bankruptcy. And in that, for my final paper, I wrote about the Zambia debt restructuring agreement, specifically posing a inquiry about whether or not this debt agreement could serve as a vehicle for corporate paternalism, as a new sort of colonialism, as Zambia postulating as a possible de jure colony of China in relation to its current like free status. It's a very young country, and it's only been free for like 70 years. So in light of that, I've been questioning about how we should use our internal resources to develop without using those corporate paternalistic structures, especially for countries that are a little bit younger, especially when we're trying to be more radical, especially when we're looking at the people of the country themselves. Like, those are the people that are going to be really making the change and really changing the country into its new nation, its new state that we're sort of idealizing here. And one thing that I'm concerned about is the fact that not only is the state so young, but the people, the demographics are also so young. And so if we're talking about like the media and education and the resources available to make that radical endeavor to change what the colonial state was with Europe to this potential colonial state with China, like how we're going to change that. The fact of the matter is our people, I think it's about 60% of the demographic is under the age of 16. That's a big deal when we're talking about what's important to the people and the sort of minds that are at large in the global society. If we're talking about corporate finance and climate change and everything like that, are our people going to be able to address those issues systemically and how they're connected to the systemic changes, seeing as them being under 16, they weren't there to see the revolution of being freed from Europe, and now the implications of repeating that history possibly with China. So these are a lot of big picture questions, I know, but I would love to hear sort of your thoughts on how the people themselves, especially in countries like this, can mobilize to make these radical efforts.
Great question. Professor Ohio, can you raise your hand up? Do you see that professor back there? Professor Ohio, you have to talk to that man. He might have something very good for you.
Hello, I guess I'll get up since everyone has gotten up. So my name is Rugi Diallo. I am here as the Economic Research Officer for ITUC, Global Unions. So ITUC is the International Trade Union Confederation. But I'm just gonna go back a little bit to TWAIL, because actually I have more of a economics training, but I took this one international law and climate class, and that's where I was introduced to TWAIL. And I remember having conversations with my classmates around the idea that even though the international law system came out of the colonial and post-colonial period, and therefore the rules of the game are made for, the colonizers, there are ways in which previously or formerly colonized countries have been able to leverage that same international system for their own purposes. So an example that we have discussed before is the efforts around the right to development. That is something that came up with the new economic international order, and a lot of the efforts that happen in the UN system as well. And so I guess my question is to kind of maybe bring us to a bit more of a place of hope is, are there ways in which even small spaces in which this international system can be leveraged for good, for development, for the benefit of the people on the African continent? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And now, all the answers and solutions and what stands between us and the reception are to my left, including the three JAPA, what did you call them again? Sorry. The solutions. So Jen, we need to go to this reception and you need to help us to get to the reception.
I'll be brief.
No, it's not being brief, answering also like fully.
No, but you see, some of them are comments and some questions have responded to other issues raised. But very, very good issues coming up. And I will respond to, I'll give the professor most of the questions. The issue, Jason, you are raising on polluters tax. It will depend on the policy frameworks at the national level and regional level and continental level, what we have. I will just give you an example that in Africa, apart from South Africa, the rest of the African countries, when you look at their investment policies, they are so bad. It's about investor rights without any obligation. They come in, they do what they want, they are given incentives, they take out their money. You do anything, there is the investor-state dispute settlement. That's the structure. So how do you tell them to pay taxes? They will take you to that court, ISDS court. So these are things which we need to do, and it's a matter of knowing where we want to go, what we want to achieve, and then we organize our policies, our institutions around that. But although we have the Agenda 2063, we have the CFTA, we haven't yet as Africa been able to really be clear. This is what we want to do. This is where we want to be, and then we negotiate. You talked about the international system, how we can leverage it. The international system, you negotiate. You have to negotiate what you want. Jason, you talked about IRA, CBAM. This is what America, they are big boys. When they say this is what they want, they go again. They are boys. they go on and do it. That's why they put IRA in place. CBAM, they are not. When you look at the WTO, they are not supposed to do that. You see, but they can't be able to do that. But we countries will have to negotiate our way. But we need to know what do we want. Recently, when we were in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization in Abu Dhabi, they didn't negotiate for the technology transfer. They didn't. Yet we are talking about energy transition, and coming back to your point of working together as Africa, common voice. You say we want technology transfer. You negotiate it, but all that is missing out. So for me, I think we need to do much more. I agree, my sister, to the hashtag, don't take, don't give, and we'll be okay. Thanks.
Well,
Bio.
Yeah, and I would just start from what seems to be the most, I think one of the most important things we need to do and attend to is the question on the role of the press. And I will speak to that very quickly. Do what you've always done, keep informing. But please, when you inform on climate change, don't use 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius. Nobody understands what that is. Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. Nobody understands. And even 1.5 trillion, $2 trillion, it's difficult to imagine. So how can you help us? Help us break this down. We are currently, Canada is supposed to be developed, but the level of climate illiteracy, even in Canada, is overwhelming. And on the basis of that, this government currently there might lose its job because people can't just understand what the government is trying to do on climate change. So help us simplify it. 1, 2, help us with bottom-up policy making. We need, because climate change necessarily, and every law pertaining to climate change must necessarily be a people's law. Climate change would affect everything about you. It would affect transportation, building, agriculture. It is necessarily a people issue. It must be a people law. So we can't afford for a group of guys and ladies to shut themselves in a room and then trade off on things. And then you release a law, then we fight it after 5, 10 years because it does not receive political acceptance. You need to redial and cut back. Scotland just did that yesterday. From 75% mitigation. Okay, I've used the word again, mitigation. Sorry, but you are the press person. You can help us break it down. Scotland just recently had to retreat from its target. And we have that political turnover cycle because people are not buying into climate policies because they don't just understand climate policies. So help us inform in a very simplified manner and help us with bottom-up policy making. I will try. It will be difficult to address all the issues, but I can try with Ecocide. Ecocide is a movement currently, whether it stands the chance to be recognized by the ICJ or ICC. I know that some have tried taking cases, petitions to the ICC and ICJ on the basis of Ecocide. I am a bit skeptical about its chances. The question is, do we really need it? Given how climate litigation is going around the world and some reasonably limited successes been recorded, most recently at the European Human Rights Court of Justice. So I don't really think it's absolutely needed. I think there are other pathways that we can litigate climate change without Ecocide. CBAM, polluters tax. My concern about polluters tax is that we might be playing ball with the European Union. The European Union essentially are saying, if you've got some form of carbon pricing system, then you have satisfied requirements under CBAM. And don't forget that one of the main objectives of CBAM is carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union. One of the objectives is to shield and to protect and enhance competitiveness within the European Union. So it is, you put some tax on it, you are playing ball with them because they know it keeps their companies from leaving when you put that up. So I'm concerned about that. And the very important questions about SWAIL and the relevance of that in this whole conversation, particularly international law. I agree. I think it was all in right, and I will try to leave it here, and I'm happy to engage after now. I think it was Olin Wright who spoke about different forms of social transformation, right? And it started with, well, you can be ruptural, but it's not just about being ruptural. You can be interstitial. You can work within the margins. And that's what we tried to do with the UNFCCC, but it hasn't gotten us very far.
I see the Secretary General has grabbed the mic. And, since he's representing one of those places, although he doesn't want to say that, he works there at least, that's really important in this debate. I think it's good to hear what he has to say.
Yes, I have a challenge for the Afronomicslaw group. You see this hall where we are. You put up this event. Who are those here?
Black and brown.
Apart from that, and how many black and brown? So I challenge you to think more about doing some of these things on the continent. Because when he talked about the capacity development issues, and when you were bemoaning the fact that McKinsey was running the ACS in Nairobi, honestly speaking, I think Africa has the expertise that are all out there to come to be able to give this message at home. Because at the end of the day, there's a tendency that they will listen to you more in terms of what the issues are, because you do appreciate what the issues are. And the civil service, the public servants cannot have that capacity that he's talking about without hearing from you. So my challenge is bring this debate home and let's plan a more robust forum where people can really hear you out. The policymakers can hear you out. The African Development Bank and the regional development banks can hear you out, and really Afro-Exim Bank, and engage more robustly from an African perspective. Now, CBAM is not going to do us any good. The reason it's not going to do us any good is because they believe that we're not transforming in our so-called climate sensitive development, right? Such that South Africa, which manufactures Mercedes-Benz, cannot export to Europe when that comes in, because they'll say, well, you've not transformed your economy. So you can't export Mercedes to us because you're still using the old system, and and we're going to phase out that very soon. So your industry is going to die. That's what is going to happen. And what does Africa need to do? Those are the things you need to think about and bring home. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll say a few closing remarks, and the remarks that Vince made actually are really consistent with what I was going to say in closing. So one, I'll start with that one, which is, Afronomicslaw is really mostly about knowledge production. You've seen the books we've put out there. We have a network, Vince, of over 300 students in Africa. In our academic forum, one of the things we run there, run by the editor, Ohio Omiunu. Put up your hand again. When we went and launched the book, when we launched the climate, maybe we should have had that picture up here. When we launched the climate finance book in Nairobi, we'll send you the pictures. You should have seen the number of students that came to the front when we took the picture with the academic forum. These are all students just in one country, in one African country. We had about 50 students who came to that event. We have students who we have a student who is working at Clifford Chance, who was part of our Afronomics academic forum. We have students who've been admitted to Georgetown. Professor Katrin Coleman there can tell you about our excellent, and we shall invite you to give an academic forum talk. We do it on Saturdays when the students don't have classes. We did, no, don't say no. Well, yes, and the low-lying fruit for us has been the students, because we are certainly not. So we do take this as an invitation. We shall come to you. I'll be in Nairobi in October, to the climate. By the way, the press thing, when we launched our book, I went on Nation TV, and it's not true that people necessarily find this very complicated. The journalist, I forget his name, he runs a program at 9 p.m. in Nairobi. He said the engagement on their Nation internal site at the forum where we sort of announced the book, and there was somebody who previously worked at the IMF, and there was somebody else who worked in the civil society group. They said that was one of the most active sessions ever of public engagement. So I think the press just needs to take these ideas and publicize them better than we as academics. And also, I think the last thing I want to say is collaboration. Jason Braganza, who leads AfroDAD, which is sort of the leading debt group in Africa, is part of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. He's part of, AfroDAD is part of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. We founded it during the pandemic over Zoom, and we've done many programs all across Africa. We are going to now grow AFCOD 3 in Madagascar, 4, Mozambique, sorry. Coming up. So we do lots of programming in Africa. And just mentioned, we launched the first book in Accra, Ghana. And this is not just pop-up visits, because as you can hear, we have many foot soldiers, so to speak. And I think this sort of bears out the point that Fumi was making about the important intersection between the external and internal. Lastly, I think now, since I've taken the hog all the time, I want to introduce the team, because also that relates to your point, Vince. Where is Samantha? Samantha, stand up, Samantha. Samantha Kanoyangwa is our coordinator. She is based in Harare, Vince. She was the winner of our first competition of African students on debt. That's how we came across Samantha. And Jason was very gracious. We stole her from Aphrodite, although there's a debate about who discovered Samantha. So Samantha, thank you for your work. We actually are incorporated in Kenya, by the way, Vince. And as you heard, we filed a case in the East African Court of Justice this week, which is going to be our next event. One of our editors, right next to Samantha there, Dr. Titilayo Adebola. Could you please stand up? She's an IP expert, intellectual property, the leading intellectual property lawyer in Africa. Nobody cheat you. And if you really doubt it, read the African Journal of International Economic Law, the best article ever written on African IP. She's the one. She's the guru. There is the emperor in, okay, so let me let the emperor, Professor Ohio Omiunu at the back. Come on in the front, people need to see you. He also international economic law, does many things, like we don't have tons of money. All this stuff we design, he's the one who designs them. In addition to leading the academic forum, which I said now at the moment has maybe over 300 students across East, West, and Southern Africa. So he does an amazing job. Last but not least is the Emperor Olabisi Akinkube, Professor Olabisi Akinkube, who is international trade, international investment law, and is a social media guru, among many other things. I tease him. He's on the Executive Council of the American Society of International, the Society of International Economic Law, the Canadians. If I want to go on, I would. Oh, he is also elected to the American Journal of International Law that claims to be the leading journal on international law. Anyway, so thank you so much for coming. There's a really great reception right next door. Take as many books as you can. They are free, but Vince, you have to buy since you work in the African Development Bank. And I'm really delighted. I also want to introduce you to my cousin, Sister Mombi. She leads, Sister, you have to raise your hand up or stand up. She's not here? Sister. Okay. To Taunana. But anyway, so thank you very much for coming. And I welcome you to the reception that is next door. And look forward to a more informal conversation over drinks. Don't be in a hurry. The Emperor BC has made sure there's enough drinks for everybody. So thank you so much. Thank you. Join me in thanking the panelists, by the way.